Okay.
Are we good, Erin? I don't see the. Oh, yeah, we're recording. Sorry. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name's Corey Wilhelm. I'm the library's program manager for the SUNY Office of Library and Information Services, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Open Education Week webinar. We're pleased to host Casey Ryan from Hudson Valley Community College to share about OER in criminal justice courses. Casey is an assistant professor of criminal justice at Hudson Valley and has been teaching online for over a decade and using OER for the last 5 years in a variety of criminal justice courses. Casey's research focuses on technology and deviance and accessibility in higher education. Casey has found that using OER encourages stronger student engagement with the realities of the criminal justice system today. So welcome, Casey, and you can go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you so much, Corey. And thanks so much, everyone, for being here today. So the goal of today's presentation is to share what I've learned and what I've been doing using OER for criminal justice courses, and welcome any feedback or ideas that you might have in the chat about how you're using OER in your criminal justice courses. I love taking these types of webinars and presentations because I always find something that I can incorporate in my courses from other faculty. So please feel free to share anything that's related or tangentially related to anything discussed in the chat so that we can all learn from one another. One of the pushes for me to move to OER for my courses was a specific textbook that I had that was 23 chapters, and it was all about the correctional system. And it was, $100, $125, so it was expensive. And I felt obligated as an instructor because the students purchased this expensive book, and if they tried to sell it back to the bookstore, they weren't going to get a ton of money for it. So I felt obligated that I had to use the text and I had to use it heavily, and I kind of had to limit any other required readings because they purchased this really expensive, really robust text. But the text was pretty awful, and it had one tiny, it was the thinnest chapter. It was about 11 pages, and that was race and corrections. And then there was a mention of women in corrections at the end of another chapter that really had nothing to do with gender and corrections. And so I felt as though there has to be a better way for students to learn about the correctional system and for race and gender and discussions of race and gender and who went through the original prisons, why were the first jails created, had to be a better way for everything to be incorporated. And I started to learn about OER, took the training at my institution, and was able to put together resources for students that covered all the topics that were necessary, didn't cost anything for the students, which was a major factor in my decision. As a community college, we have a lot of very low income students, and their financial aid might not cover all of their books. They might get a set amount. And so removing that hardship for students was very important to me. It also freed up a lot of that feeling of obligation. So now I could assign students to read something that was very relevant for them, very relevant for the topic, but I didn't feel like I had to rely on this really expensive text, and I could assign those additional readings. And I know some of that's just my personal feeling that I felt obligated to use it, but students are being assigned a chapter to read, and then if I was assigning additional readings, something wasn't going to get done, whether it was the additional readings or it was the chapter reading. So figuring that out by using OER has been very useful, and students have been actually reading the assigned readings. Oftentimes it's because they're a little bit more relevant to real life. It makes it easier for students to understand the material. Sometimes the textbook is super dry. And so allowing me to have control over how we connect the real world to the reading is oftentimes very useful. And especially for criminal justice courses, things change all the time. So, for example, in corrections, when we're learning about the death penalty, the textbook would have X number of states still have the death penalty. But in reality, fewer states have the death penalty. So I'm telling the students, you need to read this chapter. You need to learn about the death penalty. And then when it comes to class time and we're explaining it, oh yeah, by the way, that's not accurate. And so it kind of calls into question the legitimacy of the text for students, because many of them, first-year students, this textbook is supposed to be factual, isn't it? And not quite understanding that the criminal justice system does change all the time, depending on where you are. And so having the option of having some base information for students, so Furman v. Georgia, Gregg v. Georgia, about the death penalty, what are those court decisions state about the death penalty, some history of the death penalty, that's not going to change. But then having the option of not only using OER, but additional resources like the Death Penalty Information Center that can give a more updated view for students. And that's so important in criminal justice, is to have things be updated. So whether it's a law, it's a policy, you're talking about cannabis and cannabis policies, not feeling tied to the text has been such a useful tool, has improved student engagement because it's not just this dry textbook. We are working on things together. Let's explore the cannabis laws in Massachusetts. Let's explore the laws in New York. What are they doing in New Mexico? So being able to have that a little bit more freedom with the course material, with the required materials, has made using OER just so much better for the student experience and also for my teaching experience, I think. Another category that I kind of consider when I'm thinking about, should I use OER in this course, is what is the student population? And at Hudson Valley, we have a lot of non-traditional students, but we also have a ton of traditional age students who are that Gen Z population who have grown up watching short videos and oftentimes complete their schoolwork on their phone. With the traditional textbook, you need to oftentimes have the book with you or have access to the ebook, but you have to lug around that big textbook, which means you're probably not going to carry it around with you. And so you're kind of limited as to when you're going to actually be able to read. Using OER and having everything linked in the Brightspace course means if they're on the bus on the way to school and they have a 20-minute bus ride, they can pull up an article that I've assigned, and the article's pretty short. They'll be able to read that. If I want them to watch a 10-minute video, they can do that on their phone. Opposed to assigning a chapter for them to read, not all of them will get the e-textbook, and most of them are not going to carry around the giant textbook. If they're on break from work, if they have, an hour because their kid is napping, they can read something quick on their phone, and they're actually reading it, meaning they're actually engaging with the material, which is so awesome. So that's kind of my why I've shifted to OER, is considering the discipline of criminal justice, really wanting to make sure that things are accurate, like death penalty information, how many states still have the death penalty, but also making it relevant to the students, and then thinking about how students learn and how best to meet those learning goals. So with criminal justice, we're a little bit limited with existing OER texts. We don't have a ton of them if you are in math or some of the sciences or English. There's a little bit more in terms of options for traditional text style OER. There is an introduction to criminal justice text that I've been using. And that is something I've been using for my honors Intro to Criminal Justice course. It's an introduction to the American criminal justice system through Open Oregon. And it's put together by a bunch of different authors, and it covers the full span of the criminal justice system. And I've used the full text for my honors intro course. I teach criminal justice capstone, which is that last course that the students take before they graduate. And we do a review of the system. And so I also use the same text because we're reviewing the system. And this is part of their readings for that review. And the way that it's organized, you can easily link to specific chapters. So when I teach criminology, we do a section about research and research methods and different ways that criminal justice research happens. And so I can link to chapter 2 about measuring crime. I can link to the section on criminology if I wanted to use that for my overview of criminology section of the course. If you're teaching Intro to Criminal Law, you could link to just that section. Or if you're discussing policy with a class, you can just link to the policy section. So it has a lot of options, not just for an intro course, but for just using a section of it for one of your other courses as an OER option. There's also things for criminal law. There's a Canadian book on criminology that I've started to look at as I move my juvenile delinquency course to OER and my criminology course to OER. So there's a Canadian text. So a lot of the examples and discussions of the system are Canadian specific, which wouldn't be relevant for a US based student. But the theories and the understanding of the theories and the summaries of the theories, that's not going to change. So it might just require me kind of picking and choosing and doing a little extra work there. But that could be useful just to get a base for a delinquency theory course or criminology course. So a question, have I ever surveyed students to see what they think? Absolutely. That is my last slide. It has a whole bunch of student feedback. That's something that I do with all my courses is I ask them just for feedback on the course. And so one of the questions for students who use OER is, what did you think about using the articles and the short text that I wrote? What did you think about that versus taking a course where you use a traditional textbook? So going to share those ideas. So we have this intro book that might make sense to use a portion of it or the entire thing, depending on what you're teaching. And then there's also the ability in my library at Hudson Valley to search for an open access resource. So not necessarily a full text, but an article or an open access book that might not show up in like the SUNY OER database because it's not necessarily considered to be OER, but it is open access. And so I just searched delinquency as my search term, and I checked off to limit the resources to open access. I end up with over 7,000 results. Not all of them are going to be useful or relevant, but it's an option when putting together resources and trying to hit that 51% of your course using OER to browse your library. Your library at your institution likely has the same limiting factors. And so I can go through these and find something maybe specific to each content area in delinquency, bring that in to hit that 51% and be more relevant to students maybe than reading a drier traditional text. So lots of options with finding OER using the library database or using that intro text. We just don't have a ton of text style books for OER with criminal justice courses. You can always make something yourself. And I've done that short sections for my corrections course, more so just overview of topics. If it was something that I couldn't find an open resource for, and I was still needed to hit that 51% of the course being open access, I just wrote something, attached the Creative Commons to it, and then students had access to that. Other faculty that were teaching the same course as I was, they had access to it. And it was just kind of like a summary of the topic. So there's a summary of the history of criminal justice. That's a time commitment. That took time to put together. And I was lucky enough to receive funding because it was when SUNY had all that OER funding for faculty. And so my institution was able to provide me with a very small stipend, but I got something out of it to put that together and to have this new OER course. Yes, the library is probably one of my favorite things in the world. And I was able to just show a faculty member something in our library that they didn't know about that they could incorporate in their course. So that's one of the things I learned about when I first started teaching, is that the libraries that we have access to, whether it's your institution or SUNY-wide, have an enormous amount of resources that we can bring in for our students. And so teaching face-to-face, if I didn't feel like teaching the full lecture that day, films on demand. If you have access to films on demand through your library, use it. There's tons of criminal justice stuff in films on demand, and most of it is a little bit more recent, and that helps with that student engagement, and it's relevant. And you can tie it back to a reading. So show a video about what jails are really like. There's a great video on Films on Demand. It's part of the Life Inside series, I think. Life Inside Jail, Hell on Earth. It's about the Albany County Correctional Facility. And it shows the inside of what that jail looks like. It discusses a local case to Albany. And so for my students from the Albany area, they love that because it's relevant. They've driven by it on the way to the airport. Oh, I know where the jail is. Oh, I had no idea what it looked like on the inside. Or they know a CO who works there, or they know somebody who's been incarcerated there. And so having access to those library resources, whether they're OER or there's something that you can use to supplement OER, is so awesome. And that's one of the things that is part of the feedback that I've gotten from students, is that they really liked those videos. And if I had a traditional textbook, I would not be as comfortable assigning them to watch a portion of a video, because I would feel as though the students would just watch the video and they wouldn't read any of the text. And I had student feedback, a decade ago. Why did we have to buy this book if we're just using all this other stuff? That's a great question, right? I want to use all this other stuff. And so now with OER, that kind of takes care of the why did we have to buy it? Thank you so much for the feedback. And so that's kind of really the other point on this slide, is finding stuff that is relevant to students. News articles. If you're teaching juvenile delinquency, use the OJJDP website and pull up stats on delinquency. Pull up stats on research on who is in juvenile detention facilities, how Indigenous girls are overrepresented in all these states. Making things a little bit more real in criminal justice courses is more, not entertaining, because I'm not here to entertain, but I want students to want to learn more. And so I need to have a little bit of that entertainment factor. I want them to be engaged. And when students feel like what they're learning has relevance in their life, they're going to be more engaged. They're going to have more questions, and I can direct them to more resources instead of saying, oh, on page 29 of, chapter 2, that's where that's discussed. I love being able to make it more real for students. So I use a lot of the Vera Institute of Justice. I use a lot of the Marshall Project readings. So one example is the Marshall Project put an article out back at the beginning of 2020 on Mississippi restitution centers, which one of my areas for content and corrections is intermediate sanctions. So things that are not quite incarceration, but not as kind of minimally invasive like traditional probation. And so we talk about things like house arrest and electronic monitoring. And I can throw in this article about restitution centers, which most of them fell out of favor by the 80s, but Mississippi still has them. Student engagement on this article was amazing. I had students read it as a short writing assignment and respond to it. What did you think about it? What were your feelings on it? What did you learn? What did you find new or interesting? Did you know anything about restitution centers prior? And so sometimes when I teach corrections, I have students, I know everything about jails. My cousin is a CO, so I know all about jails. And so sometimes it's a little bit more difficult for those students to get engaged with the material because they might have a preconceived idea. They might feel like they know everything. So being able to bring in material that is new and different from what they know or might shake up their understanding is very useful to get them more engaged and getting them asking more questions. So this is an example of one of those articles that if I use a traditional text, I wouldn't feel comfortable assigning this and the traditional text reading because that would probably be too much for that week or that module. And I knew that something wouldn't get done. And I wanted students to learn a little bit of everything, but with a 30-page chapter plus a 7-page article, they're not going to read some of the important basics about the topic that they need. So if I can find a shorter open access OER text chapter, or write something up myself for Creative Commons, or find an article about intermediate sanctions that's open access to my library, and I can assign those 10 pages plus these 7 pages, that's going to be more manageable for students, and they're actually going to read the material, and it's going to be relevant and important to them. And that's really my goal, is that they learn something. They want to learn more, and I can give them those kind of extra opportunities. So I use the Marshall Project a ton. There's lots of journalism style articles. If you've never used the Marshall Project, it's a nonprofit organization that just focuses on journalism about the criminal justice system. So all different topics are covered. This is just one example. I've also used this piece by the Los Angeles Times and the Marshall Project called Upgrade Your Jail Cell for a Price. This is a pretty long article. So I've broken it down into sections before. I've read a portion in a face-to-face class with students, or I've had this be an additional reading, but not required for maybe a DL course. But it's about, in California, that individuals who can afford it can pay to stay in a small city jail rather than going to the larger county jails in California. The county jails are notoriously overcrowded, oftentimes overcrowded to the point that they're very unsafe. But if you have money, you can pay and you can go to a very small city jail that has like amenities, like a nice hotel. And students who read this article are often shocked because we learn in class, we learn with our traditional style readings that this is how jails work. But the criminal justice system doesn't actually work the way that it was designed. And so having these additional resources can kind of make the criminal justice system more real and allow students to recognize and to learn that it doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. I also use this article from the Vera Institute of Justice about Kentucky called Keeping the Lights On. And this is about how in Kentucky, the state prison system is so overcrowded that the prison system pays local jails to house people who are supposed to be in prison. And one of the things that we learn when we learn all about what jails are is we learn what are the reasons why somebody could be in jail. And people that are supposed to be in prison, they're not supposed to be in jail, they're supposed to be in prison. But what's the reality? In Kentucky, this is how it actually works. And so students are oftentimes very intrigued by this. I've had students question, why is this allowed? And that kind of opens up the conversation to, okay, well, why would this be allowed? Who makes the decisions about how the criminal justice system works? And it allows for a little bit more deeper engagement and deeper thinking about the topic, which if they were reading a traditional textbook about jails, it would explain what jails are. It would explain how jails are used. There might be one of those little inset text boxes that gives you an example of something slightly different about jails, but that would be it. And so if you're just relying on traditional texts and you're not bringing anything outside in, that's what students are going to learn about jails. If you can have maybe a shorter OER chapter or open access article about the history of jails and how they're used, and you can bring in the LA Times article about pay to stay jails, this Kentucky article, that's super useful for students to kind of really feel engaged with the material. And then just one last Vera Institute article, just because of its relevance, is this article from the Vera Institute about the Montgomery County Jail. Amsterdam, New York is in Montgomery County, which is close enough to Albany that we do have a lot of students at Hudson Valley who are from Montgomery County, know someone, know where it is. And that little bit of relevance makes this interesting. It makes it real. I had no idea the jail was like that. I know someone who lives in Amsterdam. I know somebody who was in that jail. Oh, that makes sense based on what I've heard about the sheriff or whatever. So using these resources and teaching in New York, we tend to have a lot of articles about the New York State correction system, jails, things about New York City, Rikers Island. So you have a lot of real world stuff in the state of New York that you can use in your courses, because lots of stuff goes on that we're able to bring into our classes, which is great for that student engagement aspect. Does anybody have questions or comments? Anything that I can clarify or anything that you'd like to share?
I just have a funny story to share. While I was sitting here in my office, somebody knocked on my door, and I opened the door just to see who it was, and it was the textbook representative from Sage Publishing about new textbooks. So I just thought that was funny that
I didn't call anybody out by name. I just said there's other options. One of the other resources that I use pretty heavily is trying to get updated statistics for students about the death penalty. And so I use the Death Penalty Information Center website oftentimes to get interactive data for students and to kind of show them how many states have the death penalty. And they have a great little history, which is super useful when you're teaching about the death penalty. If you're using a traditional textbook, it's not going to be updated on a regular basis. And we know from teaching criminal justice courses that over the last decade, 15 years, states have changed how they use the death penalty, if they use it, if there's a moratorium on it, if they're voting on it, if there's a gubernatorial moratorium, constantly. And so a textbook that you've been using for the last 2 years was probably not even accurate when it went to be published because things have changed. And so having the ability to have an open access article or a chapter from an OER text or your own created material on the death penalty, and then being able to say, okay, let's check out the Death Penalty Information Center together, that's going to give the student updated material. It's going to encourage more buy-in because you're supposed to read this textbook chapter, but oh, by the way, it's not accurate. That's not really going to help with legitimacy of the reading. And so I love to use a lot of parts of the website. They have a section just on facts and research. And so you can pull up a section on the history of the death penalty, crimes that might be punishable by death, recent legislative activity, just a brief fact sheet about the death penalty is also super useful. It's quick information for students. They're going to be more likely to read that. There's a section on specific policy issues. The Death Penalty Information Center does not take a specific position, pro or con, but a lot of what they do is highlight some of the issues with the death penalty. They also have a lot of state and federal data, state by state, which is very useful, and they have interactive maps that you can use. And so this is the map from 2023. This is great if you have a lot of visual learners. If you're just listing out or reading in a reading which states have a death penalty, which don't, this is awesome for visualizing, okay, where is the death penalty more popular in the US? And so having access to something like this, and you can kind of hover over the state. It gives you the status, whether or not they still have it. So if we hover over California, there's a pause on executions by executive action, but it still has a death penalty on the books. And so then you can also have a conversation with students about, well, what does that mean? What does executive action or a moratorium mean? How could states get rid of the death penalty? So in New Mexico, they don't have it. They got rid of it in 2009. So you have this great map to visualize who still has a death penalty. And then you have it organized in a more reading way. But then you also have states without the death penalty and the year of when they got rid of it. And if you click on the state, it gives you a brief history of that state and their use of the death penalty. So for example, if you wanted to click on New York, it's going to give you a brief history of New York's use of the death penalty, which once again, super relevant for students, makes it a little bit more interesting. And then on the right side of each of the histories, it has kind of data points quickly organized. It has things like the murder rate. That's oftentimes important to discuss with students when learning about the death penalty. Is life without parole an option? Talks about things like felony murder. Is there a clemency process? And so students are interested, okay, well, when did New York get rid of the death penalty, right? Because that localized connection oftentimes makes it more interesting for students. They will highlight some famous cases related to the death penalty for that state, how the abolition process worked. We know New York's a little bit confusing. And so it has a lot of great organized information for students. And then if I was going to pick a state that still has a death penalty, so let's say that I pick Pennsylvania, once again, it's going to have the history. And I like either face-to-face or in a remote class, okay, which state should we look at next? Gets that student engagement up, allows them to participate in the production of their knowledge. Which one should we check out together? And then because it's a state with a death penalty, the information on that right side section is going to give you update. Okay, so how many people do we have on death row? In Pennsylvania, there's 127 people. There's one woman on death row. That can open the conversation to, why is there only one woman on death row? What do we know about the death penalty and gender? Where is death row? So also, how does the actual execution process work state to state? Who signs the death warrant? So lots of conversations about the death penalty that can kind of be started by showing this kind of information, which is going to be updated for you, which is so nice. So you don't have to let students know, please read this chapter, but by the way, there's not that many states who have a death penalty anymore. Gives you the population, murder rate. How does the clemency process work? Opens the conversation for what are the different ways that clemency can work. And you can go state by state and check out that information. So I love using this resource because it really, I think, makes it more real for students. And a lot of students have lots of questions about the death penalty that are not typically covered in just one section of a textbook reading about the death penalty. So having the ability to maybe have the students have a reading about Furman and Gregg, and then have a reading on the history of the death penalty, and then be able to incorporate this death penalty information center or whatever other outside resource you like to utilize. Anybody, questions, comments, feedback, anything you want to share, maybe when you teach a death penalty that you use? Oh, thanks so much. I think that idea that the textbook might not tell the whole story is something that I discovered when I kind of first moved to OER, and why I wanted to move to OER is that the text, you know, it's this major publisher, and the author of the text was somebody that I had read their research in my grad courses. And so I knew that the material was not, you know, not factual, but I also knew that it wasn't just, it was kind of limited by what is the publisher going to publish. And the publisher is going to publish stuff that's going to sell, that schools are going to want to buy, and it might not be the full, complete story. And that's not just true for criminal justice, but for other disciplines. You might not get everything into one text because you really just can't do that. And so having this freedom from obligation to just use a traditional text, having the buy-in from students, having the engagement from students from using the outside resources means that I can have these varying perspectives and have resources for students that are relevant to them, might mimic their own experience. We have a lot of justice-involved students. And so I use the Marshall Project has a great series. I can't remember if it's called Voices Inside, or not Inside Voices, but something to do with, it's a whole series about the experiences of people who are in the system, either right now or have been in the system. It allows maybe students who are justice involved or who have family or friends who are, to get maybe reassurance or get a feeling like, yeah, that happened to me too, from reading those experiences. And they're still relevant to our conversation. They're still factual. They just happen to be somebody's experience. And that really allows way more perspective on the experiences of everybody in the justice system. Yes, Sarah and I were just discussing previously the use of music that Sarah does in her courses. And I know that the students really are engaged with that because that's relevant to them. It's also a little bit different, a little bit more interesting than just, okay, what did chapter 1 say? How can we connect what we've read to this song? What's the experience of the individual or individuals in these song lyrics? So thanks so much for sharing. And feel free to jump in at any point and share anything that you think might be helpful for anybody teaching. So just kind of organize my thoughts on the learning outcomes of using OER versus maybe using a traditional text. And I kind of already touched on a little bit of these, but the idea that jails are used for these specific purposes. That's what we learn in our reading. This is why jails are used. But then if we can bring in an outside resource, it's timely, so it's a little bit more recent, it's relevant to the conversation, and it makes it real that the criminal justice system does not work the way that it was supposed to. It doesn't oftentimes work the way it was designed. And then we can have conversations about, well, why is that? And acknowledging the flaws of the system is something that particularly justice-involved youth or people who've had family or friends involved in the system appreciate. So a traditional text that says, you know, jails are set up like this and the COs do the best job ever and the people incarcerated are very violent and angry that they're there, that's not the full story. And so being able to provide an additional way to understand how the system actually works and acknowledging that there are flaws, it doesn't work perfectly, that anybody and everybody potentially could be violent or non-violent in the system, whether that's staff or people incarcerated, that once again makes the content more engaging and relevant. And it kind of gives you as an instructor a little bit more legitimacy with the student because you are acknowledging their experience. Well, you know, you're not directly acknowledging that person, but by the material that you select for the course, you're acknowledging what their life experience was like or their family or friends' life experience that impacted them. And that just gives you way more legitimacy as an instructor, as a content expert, and improves the whole learning process for them and improves the teaching process for you. Another way that OER has made my courses so much more relevant and interesting to students is when I teach capstone, we first review the criminal justice system. So how is it supposed to work? And I use that intro to criminal justice OER text. And we use that as our reading, we review, this is how the system is supposed to work. And then we learn about wrongful convictions. And I pull in a lot of peer-reviewed journal articles on false confession research, eyewitness misidentification research. But the students are super interested in learning more about that because maybe they saw a Netflix special on Essential Part 5. Today, we have lots of people being exonerated and it's in the news much more often because more and more people are being exonerated. We have conviction integrity units at prosecutors' offices that oftentimes will make the news as well. And so you have a lot of outside resources to bring in to discuss wrongful convictions. My capstone students really enjoy using the National Registry of Exoneration or viewing the Innocence Project website together as a way to learn about, okay, well, how do wrongful convictions happen? Because we just reviewed how the criminal justice system is supposed to work. Don't we have due process? Don't we have protections? What about all the amendments that we just reviewed? Why would somebody not be informed of their constitutional right to an attorney? Why would that happen? And then we can learn about official misconduct and how official misconduct works. Wait, I thought that you can match those tire tracks exactly. And we learn about junk science and how we have all these reports about some forensic techniques that were used and then disproven in the scientific community, but then continued to be used in court. Well, why would they still be continued to use in court? And we can discuss the idea of judicial discretion and how courts have historically been very slow to change. So we're able to touch upon a bunch of topics just from checking out the National Registry of Exonerations together, which even if you're not teaching a course specifically on wrongful convictions, if you're teaching intro, might have half of a lecture period where you can mention wrongful convictions and use this as a source. This has reports about how many people were exonerated. It has reports about race and wrongful conviction in the US, government misconduct. It also has all of the specific issues or contributing factors that may have led to someone being wrongfully convicted. You can go through this together with students. You can pull out one of the links and have that be an assigned reading. So please read this section on female exonerees or on official misconduct. Or please read this section on misdemeanors and wrongful convictions. A lot of what makes the news is felony cases where somebody's been in prison wrongfully for 30 years. But there's also numerous cases where people were convicted of misdemeanors and they didn't go to prison, but their life got really messed up because of the misdemeanor conviction, because of the justice involvement, and they oftentimes are not entitled to compensation. So you can have a larger conversation about that. What does that mean? And then you can also browse the cases. And this is something that my capstone students use for their final project. There's over 3,000 cases on the registry. It's from 1989 to present. And you can limit your search by contributing factor. You can limit it by the sentence that someone received, the year when they were convicted, the year when they were exonerated, if DNA evidence was present, and then where it happened. And so that's oftentimes useful for students if they want to know, well, did anybody ever get wrongfully convicted in Albany or in Troy? You can limit it by county. So you can limit it by state, and then you can specifically limit it by county. And that, for students, adds in that interesting factor, that engaging factor, because, wow, that happened here. That's not just this broad, abstract concept that, oh, some people get wrongfully convicted, but, oh, wow, people here have gotten wrongfully convicted. So there's a bunch of New York cases from across New York, so you don't have to just focus on one area. There's lots of counties that are represented when you go through all of them, and you can limit them. Has race data, age data. So maybe if you want, or if you're teaching delinquency, you might pull up individuals who were very young and were convicted as adults, and you can discuss things like raise the age legislation with students using this as a jumping off point. So lots of ways to use this, not just for a class on wrongful convictions, but for any of our courses. You can probably tie something back into the registry. You can spend a lot of time on it, or just kind of briefly show it to students, link it in Brightspace, and they can explore it on their own. And the last thing that I wanted to share is the student feedback. And this was copied directly from course surveys. So there's some spelling and grammatical errors. I didn't make them. I pulled it directly from the anonymous surveys that I give students. I give them a midpoint survey anonymously, and then a one towards the final exam period. And I asked them for feedback. What did you like? What did you not like about the course setup, about Brightspace, about assignments? The readings is one of those questions. And then I also give them an open-ended one. Anything you want to share about the course. And so some of these are from the question on what did you think about the readings? And then some of them are from the open-ended, what do you want to share about the course? I've enjoyed the articles and videos. They've been informative and actually interesting to watch and read. That to me is important engagement, that the student actually found the material interesting, which they probably would not have stated if it was a traditional text. I enjoyed the videos and real life connections to what we were learning that module, like the prison education videos. That is a video series. I think it's about fish kill. It's men who can complete their college education in prison. And then there's another video through Films on Demand, which might also be from Fishkill as well, that discusses men who train guide dogs and PTSD service dogs. And that's a program that they might be eligible for in the prison. And so I link a lot of these as not required, but might be interesting when we're learning about prisons and the prison experience. For students who just might want to know more or like watching videos, they discuss how do you have to be eligible, you have to complete programming, you can't get in trouble. All things that would be discussed in a traditional reading about a prison and prison programming and prison punishment. But this way, the students are getting the experience of watching the documentary, which they might be like more than reading. And it's about New York State, so they oftentimes find it more interesting. And there's dogs in it, right? The puppy video is always a favorite because it has puppies in it for some students. The education video, super interesting. It humanizes what we are learning and helps understand its importance. I liked how there was no textbook and only online article resources. I had other students comment, I liked that I didn't have to pay for anything for the course. I also enjoyed the videos on prisons so much and how they were in New York State, so it made it more relatable. The links to the website with specific stories of people's life in the correction system were really intriguing and educational. One of my goals for teaching is that the students will get something out of the course that hopefully encourages more learning about a topic. I really enjoyed not having a formal textbook and your use of open resources. I didn't tell the student to put that in there so that I could use it in the presentation. The articles you include and the videos you include increase the learning and provide excellent snapshots of the lesson for that week. It was unique and refreshing. So the student feedback has been really positive. I have had a few students who have said that they missed a traditional textbook. And that's why I've been trying to incorporate the use of an OER text, like that intro text, or myself writing a more traditional text summary style to incorporate rather than just some other open educational resources, because I know that some students like that structure. Also, always provide notes that incorporate all the topics that some of the OER and open access articles are going to discuss. So that way they have those notes that kind of organize the topics for themselves. And when I record using Yuja and I record the lecture notes and me explaining them, I will have the OER like I do now. I'll have it open. So if it's an article, if I want them to check out the Registry of Exonerations, if I want them to be sure that they're reading a chapter from the OER text, I can jump around. So essentially, this is exactly what my recorded lectures would look like for a student, is I'd have my notes in PDF open, and then I would jump around as I'm explaining it for a DL student. And if I was teaching face-to-face, same thing. I'd have a bunch of stuff open and we would jump around and work together to go through the material. Happy to answer additional questions for anybody. Happy to discuss more of your ideas and how you use OER. And I really appreciate everybody being here today. And hopefully that there's something that was relevant for your teaching and for your student learning. But happy to discuss anything. Anybody has questions or wants to share how they use OER in their courses.
Thank you so much, Casey. I know that you are criminal justice, but I think so much of what you shared is relevant for anyone, particularly anyone looking for OER resources. And you gave a lot of different ideas about where they can go to find those things, what kinds of things resonated with your students as far as, you know, what was engaging for them and meaningful. So, so even if someone here or watching this is not a criminal justice discipline, there's so many great takeaways, I think, that you shared. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
And I'm going to go ahead, Erin, and throw your last slide up.
Sure.
All right, and if we get any follow-up questions, we'll make sure they make their way to Casey. I want to thank everyone for your participation in today's webinar, and especially thank you to our speaker for sharing today. That was really awesome, and I work with OER services, so I loved seeing all the different ways you're using OER and libraries. The full schedule of events happening this week, along with the link to register and view recordings, is in the chat. And please complete the feedback survey to help us plan for future offerings. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Open Education Week. And thank you, Casey.
Oh, thank